Dear curious listener, you've arrived under a pale, ancient sky, where the stars don't twinkle, they judge. Your stomach aches, you're bleeding, and no one's handed you a heating pad. Instead, you're seen as dangerous, mysterious, capable of killing crops and souring wine, all because your uterus is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Tonight, we're wandering back to a time when menstruation wasn't just misunderstood, it was weaponized. A time of papyrus tampons, moon goddesses, wandering wombs, and burned toad pouches. You won't find comfort here, but you might find clarity. So settle in. You're in good company. Half the population bled through history. The other half wrote about it, badly. Subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me what country you're listening from. I promise, no ritual purification required. Now breathe. You're not unclean. You're just entering the Blood Moon Club. And it's going to be a long, ridiculous night. Long before anyone used the word period, before pads or tampons or heating pads or painkillers, menstruation was something older than language. And for ancient humans who lived by the tides and died by the seasons, it wasn't just biology, it was cosmic. Back then, the menstrual cycle wasn't called a cycle at all. It was simply the moon. And the moon, as it turns out, had opinions. Because here's what early people noticed. Most women bled on a schedule, about every 28 or 29 days. And that just so happened to be the same amount of time it took the moon to complete its orbit around Earth. Coincidence? Probably. But ancient humans weren't huge fans of coincidences. They liked explanations, preferably glowing, divine ones. Thus began one of history's oldest myths, that menstruation was ruled by the moon. Across cultures, continents, and centuries, the moon became more than a floating rock. It became a goddess, soft, glowing, mysterious, and always watching. She gave, and she took. And every time she waxed or waned, it was said, women's bodies responded. In Greece, the goddess Selene rode across the night sky in a silver chariot, her face full and round as the moon itself. She was divine femininity made visible. Her Roman counterpart, Luna, was worshipped in sacred temples, associated with intuition, cycles, and the quiet kind of power that didn't need fanfare. Meanwhile, in South Korea, a less well-known moon deity named Mayu Emwo was believed to oversee childbirth and fertility, an echo of the same pattern. Woman, moon, blood, life. Rinse, repeat. Travel across the seas to Africa, and you'll find the Dinka people of South Sudan invoking the moon goddess Abuk, guardian of women, water, and reproduction. To them, the monthly bleeding wasn't shameful. It was expected. It was part of the order of things. But mythology wasn't all moonlight and metaphors. In the Aztec world, the moon was personified by Metzli, sometimes male, sometimes female, and often soaked in blood. One myth speaks of a divine punishment. The moon goddess bleeds because she dared to disobey. Her blood, they believed, turned into snakes, insects, poison, and disease. A not-so-subtle nod to the ancient anxiety that blood was both powerful and dangerous. The Inca, too, had their lunar matriarch, Mama Killa, goddess of marriage, menstruation, and time. She kept watch over the calendar, marked the sacred days, and, yes, was responsible for making sure women bled when they were supposed to. Because even the divine had a schedule. In the Mayan tradition, things get darker still. Their moon goddess, often unnamed, often tragic, was said to have been caught sleeping with the sun god. The punishment? Eternal bleeding. Her sacred celestial blood was stored in 13 magical jars, only to be unleashed upon the world as scorpions, serpents, diseases, and natural disasters. A touch dramatic, but it did the job. And this myth, this idea that menstrual blood had consequences, would echo for centuries. For some, it was a sign of life. For others, a sign of cosmic imbalance. One ancient South American belief warned that if women's periods weren't carefully tracked and synced, the universe itself could descend into chaos, so no pressure. But for all the superstition and symbolism, there's something oddly consistent across these stories. Menstruation is never small. It's never treated like an afterthought. It's massive, divine, sometimes destructive, always loaded with meaning, and in a strange way, that early attention, even with all the fear, was a kind of reverence. Menstruation was tied to creation, to cycles, to the rhythm of the cosmos. It wasn't gross yet. That came later, much later. At this early point in human history, bleeding was a mysterious part of the natural order, the kind that made people light fires and whisper prayers and track the sky for clues. And the moon? Well, she was watching it all. A silent witness to a monthly phenomenon that half the population would endure, quietly and repeatedly, for most of their lives. There were no scientific instruments, no microscopes, just instincts and stories. But stories, as it turns out, have staying power. Some of these lunar associations still linger today, even if just in the language. The word menstruation itself comes from the Latin mensus, meaning month, which in turn is rooted in mene, the ancient word for moon. Even in modern times, phrases like moon time or moon cycle are whispered in quiet rooms by women trying to connect with something older, something sacred, something less medical. And it's not hard to understand why. In the beginning, menstruation wasn't a disorder. It wasn't a weakness. It wasn't something to be silenced with painkillers or plastic-wrapped cotton. It was a signal, a cycle, a tether between the human body and the sky itself. But as civilizations got more organized, more religious, and more patriarchal, that reverence would curdle. Blood would become a sign of impurity, of sin, of something best hidden. And the moon? Well, she would lose her throne to a god with a beard and a book. We'll get there. For now, just imagine it. A world where your bleeding wasn't taboo. Where every time you felt the cramp begin, you could look up at the sky and say, "She's full again." And that meant you were too. Welcome to the beginning. Not of shame, but of sacredness. The moon was your clock, your calendar, your companion. She didn't apologize, and neither did you. Not yet, anyway. You wake to the sound of singing. Not the kind that drifts through a radio or crackles from earbuds. No, this is deeper, older. Layered voices rising and falling like breath, echoing across the trees. You sit up slowly. The fire is low. The air smells of cedar and something sweet. Crushed leaves, maybe. Around you, women are laughing, combing each other's hair, passing bowls of food, and telling stories that the men don't get to hear. You're in the red tent, or the moon hut, or the ritual house. The name changes depending on where in the world you were born. But the idea is the same. You got your period. And instead of being cast out in shame, you were invited into something sacred. This wasn't exile. This was initiation. In many ancient communities, menstruation wasn't just tolerated. It was respected, even revered. It wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a sign you were fertile, you were connected to the land, you were powerful. And everyone, especially the men, knew it. Take Take the Cherokee, for instance. In their worldview, menstrual blood wasn't disgusting. It was potent. A woman on her cycle was believed to possess a heightened spiritual force, so powerful, in fact, that she could repel enemies, dull weapons, or even poison a would-be attacker simply by pointing at him. Not exactly subtle. Cherokee women didn't cook during their periods, not because they were considered unclean, but because they were busy being spiritually charged. They took time for themselves, joined other women, and stepped into a different kind of authority, one that didn't require approval from any council of elders. Now imagine you're in Northern California, centuries before European settlers arrived. You're Yurok or Wintu, and it's your moon time. You slip away from the village, up the hillside, to the women's house. It's quiet here. You've brought your own water and bedding. No chores, no conversation with men. You're expected to rest, reflect, and reconnect with the spirit world. This wasn't shame, it was strategy. In many of these cultures, menstruation was treated as a kind of ritual reset, a pause button, a sacred break from the usual grind. And no one thought that was selfish. They thought it was smart. Among the Kalasha people of northern Pakistan, the Bashali is the center of it all. A large house in the middle of the village where menstruating women go to spend time together. And they don't do it quietly. There's laughter, singing, storytelling, and babies crawling through the halls. Men are not allowed inside, not because women are impure, but because, well, it's not for them. And you? You belong here. This is your space, your time. Even in the Congo, among the Ituri forest people, a girl's first period is cause for celebration. Not a hushed talk in a bathroom stall. The entire community marks it with joy. There's no awkwardness, no euphemisms, no chocolate bribing. Just an acknowledgement that something powerful and irreversible has begun. You're no longer a child, but more importantly, you're not a problem. In the Alima hut, the girls are taught songs, dances, and practical wisdom. Older women pass down stories, teach them about sex, fertility, and personal strength. The girls emerge days later, not embarrassed, not ashamed, but armed, with knowledge, with pride, and perhaps a large stick. Because in one of their traditions, the newly menstruating girls go on a mock warpath, chasing the village boys around with long canes, testing their bravery and reflexes. If a boy is brave enough, he tries to sneak into the Alima hut, not to spy, but to prove himself. And if he makes it past the guards of older women, well, that's another story. Even in ancient Aboriginal Australia, young girls didn't hide their periods. They honored them. Mothers built menstrual huts where daughters would stay through their first cycle. When it was over, they bathed in the river, burned the hut, and returned home, visibly transformed. It wasn't secrecy, it was ceremony. And here's the thing most history books won't tell you. Before religion, before colonial laws, before shame, periods weren't seen as less than. They were seen as other than. Different, powerful, wild. And that wildness wasn't something to suppress. It was something to protect. Of course, not all ancient communities were this progressive. Some treated menstruation with fear, suspicion, and a generous helping of burnt offerings. But those who didn't, those who allowed menstruating women to rest, connect, and rule their own space, gave us a rare glimpse into what dignity looks like when no one's writing laws to prevent it. And sure, these rituals weren't always perfect. Sometimes women were isolated in freezing huts or denied certain foods. But even those practices were more complex than modern assumptions allow. Some women liked the break. Others took advantage of the pause to sleep, gossip, and escape their husbands for a few days. Because when society tells you that you're too sacred to sweep the floors, you don't argue. You just lie down and let the herbs do their work. So tonight, as you listen from your couch or bed, or wherever you're hiding from your to-do list, imagine a time where bleeding didn't mean hiding. It meant arrival. Your body wasn't a burden. It was a signal that you were connected to the earth, to the moon, and to the generations of women who bled before you and didn't apologize. Welcome to the ritual, the rest, the refuge. No one's knocking. No one's judging. It's your moon time, and the hut is warm. You may ask, quietly, curiously, perhaps while folding laundry, what did they use? As in, what did ancient women actually do during their periods? No pads, no tampons, no adhesive strips, no ultra-thin overnight wings. Well, buckle in, because if you're imagining ancient innovation at its peak, I regret to inform you, the answer is not efficient. It is, however, impressively resourceful, and occasionally moist. Let's start where many stories do, ancient Egypt, around 3000 BCE. You're an upper-class woman, possibly lounging in a linen dress, possibly applying crushed beetles to your lips. Don't ask. When you feel that familiar cramp, you reach for papyrus. That's right. Softened, rolled papyrus reeds, the same material they used to write religious texts, were repurposed into the earliest recorded version of a tampon. Was it comfortable? No. Was it effective? Kind of. Was it eco-friendly? Technically. But if you forgot to soften the edges, let's just say splinters weren't out of the question. Meanwhile, up in Greece, women preferred lint. Not from dryers, obviously. From fabric. They rolled it up into little plugs, sometimes wrapping it around a bit of absorbent wood. Because nothing screams gentle on the body like bark. Other Greek sources mention sea sponges, soft, squishy, harvested from the Mediterranean. Reusable, natural, and a solid option, until you remember that sterilization wasn't really a thing, which meant infections kind of were. The Romans, ever the engineers, stuffed wool into their tunics. If you were rich, it was clean wool. If you weren't, well, let's just say no one was tracking your pH balance. Some women also made makeshift belts out of cloth and string to keep absorbent materials in place. Think of it as the great-great-grandmother of the sanitary pad, only without the sanitary part. And no, it didn't stay in place. Because ancient underwear wasn't really a thing yet. Skip east to China, and you'll find something that sounds practical in theory and gritty in execution. Sand. Yes, actual, literal sand. Women would fill small cloth pouches with clean sand, use them to absorb the blood, then toss the sand out, wash the cloth, and start again. It's clever. It's low waste. And it is, undoubtedly, a chafing nightmare. In Japan, things were more refined. Paper, invented in China but embraced fully by the Japanese, became the go-to. Women would roll soft paper into plugs, secure them with fabric or bandages, and hope for the best. They didn't last long, but they were disposable. And honestly, isn't that kind of impressive? They were centuries ahead of the single-use mindset. Back in Africa, women in equatorial regions used what they had on hand. Rolls of soft grass, carefully cleaned and dried. In some parts of the continent, moss was used. Thick, absorbent, and surprisingly effective. Native American women also favored moss, often layered with buffalo skin or soft bark, fashioned into pads and tucked into handmade garments. No plastic, no branding, just survival. In Hawaii, women use the hapu'u fern, plucking its fuzzy underlayer to make soft, spongy padding. In Indonesia, vegetable fibers were shaped into plugs or folded into pads, organic, biodegradable, and wildly uncomfortable by modern standards. Here's the part no one likes to dwell on. No matter where you lived or what you used, you probably didn't have more than one or two of them. You cleaned them, you reused them, you dried them in the sun, and you prayed no one else in the house used them as kindling. Washing these items wasn't just labor-intensive, it was awkward. In many cultures, blood was considered sacred, or dangerous, or cursed, which meant soaking your rags in public view might make your neighbors suspicious, or send the local priest into a frenzy. So women washed them in secret, behind huts, after dark, far from the communal well, because heaven forbid anyone see the physical evidence that, gasp, you were functioning normally. Now imagine wearing these makeshift solutions, under nothing. Because for much of history, women didn't wear underpants. That's not to say they were walking around completely exposed. Skirts, robes, tunics, and layers of fabric helped. But your undercarriage? Open to the breeze. Some women simply bled into their clothes. They wore red petticoats to disguise the stains. They layered garments strategically. They carried herbs, not just for scent, but to ward off what was believed to be bad blood vapors. Yes, that was a thing. And yet, despite all this discomfort, the makeshift padding, the secrecy, the splinters, most women just managed. They bled quietly. They stitched, soaked, and adapted, and no one wrote it down. Because in ancient records, war gets scrolls, philosophy gets statues, menstruation gets de-silence. So if you're listening to this now from your air-conditioned bedroom, wearing a commercial pad, tampon, cup, or ultra-thin organic linen whatever, take a second to appreciate the sheer willpower of history's women. They weren't given comfort. They built it, with papyrus, and wool, and moss. Was it glamorous? No, but it worked. Well, most of the time. You may now proceed to thank your cotton blend underwear, and maybe, just maybe, light a candle for the woman who first looked at a sea sponge and thought, I bet that'll do the job. Let's talk about Pliny the Elder, to be precise, Roman naturalist, philosopher, and part-time enthusiast of everything that didn't make sense. He wrote one of the most influential encyclopedias of the ancient world, Naturalis Historia, 37 volumes of wisdom, curiosity, and pure, unfiltered nonsense. He cataloged plants, animals, minerals, volcanoes, stars. He tried in his own way to explain how the world worked. And then he got to menstruation. Oh, Pliny. According to Book 7, menstruating women are dangerous. Not metaphorically, not poetically, just literally, agriculturally, and apocalyptically dangerous. He writes, and please imagine this being read aloud by a very serious Roman man in a very serious toga, that the mere touch of a menstruating woman can kill bees, turn new wine sour, dry up seeds, make fruit fall from trees, blunt the edge of steel, tarnish polished mirrors, and, perhaps most dramatically, cause dogs to go mad and foam at the mouth. Yes, that's right. Menstrual blood didn't just inconvenience polite society. It destroyed crops. It rusted iron. It made the skies tremble and the livestock weep. One woman. One period. Global consequences. Now, to be fair, Pliny was a product of his time. A time when science was mostly just guessing loudly and writing it down in Latin. But even by first-century standards, this was a lot. He claimed that if a menstruating woman walked through a field naked, again not recommended, pests would drop dead and hailstorms would flee. So naturally, she should be kept indoors, possibly forever. This wasn't satire. This was Pliny being helpful. He wasn't trying to villainize women. He genuinely thought he was warning people about a biohazard, a slow-moving, red-tinted force of nature that could unmake the world's harvest. And the worst part? People believed him for centuries. His writings were copied, cited, and taught across Europe and beyond. His menstrual madness echoed into the Middle Ages, where theologians and physicians repeated his claims with wide-eyed confidence. In medieval Europe, blood in general was feared. It was seen as impure, destabilizing, a sign that the body was off balance. So naturally, menstrual blood was considered the worst kind. It wasn't just gross, it was contagious. Doctors in the 13th century warned that touching menstrual blood could give you leprosy, or epilepsy, or spiritual corruption. Even a woman's gaze during her period was said to be dangerous. According to one monk, she could kill a man just by looking at him, which, honestly, sounds like something most modern women would pay extra for. These weren't fringe ideas. These were mainstream. They were written in Latin. They were endorsed by the church. They were printed in books and whispered across bedsides and passed from father to son. Menstruating women were to be avoided, pitied, and kept far away from anything important: fields, food, altars, husbands. And all because Pliny the Elder had a theory and no filter. Let's pause here and remember something important. Pliny died while investigating the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. He literally ran toward a volcanic disaster. This is not the man you want writing your reproductive health guide, but write it he did. And his words stuck. Even in cultures that didn't read Latin, the same logic reappeared. Across Europe, Africa, Asia, myths popped up blaming menstruating women for everything from bad weather to failed harvests to male impotence. The logic was simple. If a woman was bleeding and not dying, something must be wrong. She was clearly holding some kind of secret power. And if there's one thing patriarchal systems hate, it's unregulated female power. So what do you do when someone's body defies your understanding? You make it sacred, or you make it dangerous. Pliny chose the latter, and the world followed suit. Even today, traces of his nonsense linger. In some places, menstruating women are still forbidden from cooking, entering temples, or even sleeping in their own homes. In others, they're told not to hold babies or touch pickles or plant seeds during their cycle, because something bad might happen. Ask where those rules came from, and you'll likely get silence, or an eye roll. But if you dig deep enough, past the folklore and into the footnotes, you'll find Pliny, in his toga, with his scroll, ruining your salad. It's tempting to laugh at all of this, and honestly, please do. But it's also worth noting how quickly misinformation spreads when wrapped in a robe of authority. Pliny wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a priest. He was a curious man with a pen and far too much confidence. And thousands of years later, we're still untangling the myths. So if you've ever felt weird about bleeding, if you've ever tried to hide a tampon up your sleeve, if you've ever heard someone joke about that time of the month like it's a curse, just know you're not gross. You're not dangerous. You're just bleeding. And somewhere, Pliny is probably spinning in his ash-covered grave, wondering why the bees are still alive. It starts in your lower back, a dull ache that creeps around your hips like it's trying to break into your pelvis. Then comes the tightness, the kind that makes you stop mid-sentence and grip the edge of something. Anything. A tree, a stool, your own resolve. You're bleeding. Again. But here's the thing. It's not just bleeding. According to ancient wisdom, it's judgment. You are quite literally being punished. Because once upon a time, long before Midal, and heat patches and hot water bottles with floral covers, there was Eve, and a snake, and a piece of fruit. And now, here you are, doubled over behind a temple, clutching your uterus because someone else got curious about apples. In ancient religious logic, this all checks out. Cramps aren't a medical condition, they're penance. Welcome to the divine comedy of period pain. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, menstruation was seen as a necessary but unclean process, and pain was part of the package. Eve ate the fruit, and God, not one for half measures, handed out labor pain and menstrual cramps as a lifelong reminder. Because why settle for one form of suffering when you can have two? In early Christianity, the same logic held. St. Augustine wrote that suffering was the rightful inheritance of all women, a kind of sacred affliction designed to keep you humble. Cramps weren't just tolerated. They were theologically endorsed. No one was handing you a heating pad. You were expected to pray harder, to repent more sincerely, to accept the pain as part of your spiritual identity. And if the pain became unbearable, you had options, sort of. You could consult a midwife who might offer you herbs, secretly, of course, lest someone accuse her of witchcraft. Or depending on where you lived, you could burn a toad. No, really. In parts of medieval Europe, the prevailing wisdom was this: burn a toad to ash, put those ashes in a pouch, and wear it around your waist. The logic? No one's quite sure, but apparently nothing says healing like a crispy amphibian amulet. Some remedies were a little more grounded. Women boiled mixtures of mugwort, pennyroyal, or chamomile. But if those herbs didn't work, it wasn't because the remedy failed. It was because you had sinned more than usual. It's hard to argue with that kind of logic. Meanwhile, over in Greece, a man named Hippocrates, yes, that Hippocrates, was laying the groundwork for what we now call Western medicine. He meant well, but unfortunately, he believed the uterus had mobility. According to Hippocrates, the womb could wander. If it became dry or frustrated or neglected, whatever that means, it might detach itself and float freely around your body, into your lungs, your liver, your brain. The cure? Marriage, preferably with regular intimacy, because obviously your cramps were happening because your womb was lonely. Enter Galen, another celebrated Greek physician. He inherited Hippocrates' ideas and sprinkled in some humor theory. That's humor as in bodily fluids, not comedy. Though honestly, the overlap is striking. He claimed that women, being colder and wetter than men, couldn't digest food properly. This caused excess blood, which had to be released once a month, or it would rot inside you. Your period wasn't a cycle, it was a purge, a necessary exorcism of flawed femininity. The more you bled, the more broken you were. But if you didn't bleed at all, that was worse. Some doctors believe that unpurged menstrual blood could cause hysteria, madness, or spontaneous combustion of the soul. Okay, maybe not the last one, but the rest? Fully endorsed. Let's take a moment to reflect. Your uterus, the one currently clenching like it's training for a medieval tournament, was misunderstood, demonized, and blamed for just about everything. And the people doing the blaming? Men, in robes, with scrolls. They didn't ask women what cramps felt like. They just assumed it was either divine wrath or poor lifestyle choices. And so, rather than treat your pain, They theorized it. They wrote pages. They held debates. They diagnosed wombs from across the room. And you? You curled up in the corner of your hut with a handful of dried herbs in a toad pouch. Because that's what medicine looked like when your suffering was seen as symbolic. This wasn't just bad science. It was institutionalized indifference. No one asked what you needed. They told you what you deserved. And sure, not every culture agreed. Some offered steam baths, oil massages, even sacred rituals to ease the ache. But by and large, the ancient world was less interested in relieving your pain and more concerned with moralizing it, which means the next time someone tells you to just push through or mind over matter, you can inform them calmly, confidently, that you're simply honoring 2,000 years of theological uterine torture. And then maybe suggest they wear a toad, because some traditions should be shared. You're not well. You've been dizzy for days. Your appetite's vanished. You're short of breath. And the local physician has finally come to a conclusion. Your womb has wandered, not emotionally, not metaphorically, literally. It has packed its metaphorical bags and floated up toward your lungs, possibly your throat, maybe your brain. The diagnosis is clear. You are suffering from hysteria caused by a wandering womb. You'd laugh if you weren't currently clutching your chest and being advised to sniff burning goat hair to lure it back down. Because apparently your uterus is a skittish, moody animal that roams your body like a lost sheep. And if you don't anchor it, preferably with regular marriage and childbearing, it'll cause all sorts of chaos. Night terrors, seizures, emotional outbursts, the desire to read. You're not misunderstood. You're medically alarming. Welcome to ancient gynecology. The theory of the wandering womb dates back to Hippocrates. Yes, he's back, and echoed through the dusty halls of ancient Greece, Rome, and medieval Europe for over 1,000 years. They believed the womb was a kind of independent creature, untethered inside the female body, prone to movement and easily offended. It might climb upward and suffocate you. It might press against your stomach and cause vomiting. It might lean too far left and create melancholy, or too far right and trigger mania. 1 minute you're fine. The next, your uterus has moonwalked into your ear canal. The treatment? A combination of scented compresses, bad advice, and getting married as soon as possible. The idea was that regular intimacy, and ideally pregnancy, would give the womb something to do, so it wouldn't feel the need to wander. So basically, your uterus is bored, and possibly lonely. And you, poor thing, are just the collateral damage. Now, if that wasn't absurd enough, let's talk architecture. Because ancient physicians didn't just believe the uterus moved, they also believed it had rooms. 7 of them. This brings us to the lesser-known but equally bewildering 7-chamber theory. According to this model, widely circulated by ancient and medieval medical texts, the uterus was made up of 7 distinct compartments. 3 on the right side for boys, 3 on the left side for girls, and 1 right in the middle for hermaphrodites or wasted pregnancies. That's right. Your reproductive organs came with a floor plan. Fetal real estate, if you will. The sex of the baby didn't depend on chromosomes or hormones. It depended on where the seed happened to land in your internal uterus maze. If the sperm took a sharp right, congratulations, you're having a son. If it veered left, it's a daughter. If it crashed into the middle wall, well, sorry. No upgrade this cycle. Medical diagrams from the period even attempted to draw these chambers, like some sort of uterine advent calendar, tiny boxes, little labels, minimal logic. Of course, none of this was based on dissection. Most male physicians weren't allowed to study actual female anatomy. They weren't consulting wombs. They were consulting Aristotle, who once famously claimed that women were deformed males. Great. Still, these theories made their way into textbooks, church doctrine, and medical lectures for centuries. And since most women couldn't read, couldn't vote, and certainly couldn't correct a physician, the myths stuck. You, dear listener, were not a person with a body. You were a vessel with a malfunctioning GPS system, a walking enigma, a ticking biological bomb. Feeling faint? It's not stress. It's your uterus rising. Feeling sad? Must be a wayward ovary hovering near your spleen. Better burn some herbs and hope she finds her way home. To make matters worse, if you died of unexplained causes, which happened often, given the complete lack of reproductive health care, your wandering womb was blamed posthumously, as if, on top of everything, your uterus had committed the ultimate betrayal. And while all of this may sound laughably wrong now, its consequences were real. Real women were institutionalized, isolated, and dismissed as hysterical, a term that comes directly from hystera, the Greek word for womb. So let's recap. The uterus floats. It has a preferred seating arrangement for fetuses. It demands attention, loyalty, and preferably a husband. If neglected, it will wreak havoc on your entire body, and possibly your social standing. This wasn't fringe theory. This was mainstream medicine, and it served one very convenient purpose. It kept women's bodies firmly in the hands of men who didn't understand them and didn't want to. So if you've ever sat in a doctor's office, described your symptoms, and been told it's probably just stress, congratulations. You're part of a long, rich tradition of being underestimated by people with stethoscopes. But you're also part of a longer tradition of women surviving despite the bad maps drawn of their bodies. Your uterus isn't lost. It never was. But the people trying to control it? They've been wandering for centuries. Let's begin with a simple observation. When a woman becomes pregnant, her period stops. And sometime later, her breasts begin producing milk. To the ancient mind, the conclusion was obvious. Menstrual blood becomes breast milk. Logically, naturally, magically. Case closed. Welcome to another brilliant episode of We Don't Know How Anything Works, featuring your favorite historical panel of ancient male scholars who were baffled by uteruses, terrified of nipples, and very confident with a quill. This theory, that breast milk was simply period blood that had been rerouted, wasn't a fringe idea. It was mainstream. Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen believed it. Medieval doctors believed it. Theologians believed it. And since no one was asking women about their experiences, the belief stuck. Here's how it worked, according to speculative ancient medicine. A woman, being naturally cold and damp, obviously, could not efficiently digest food the way a warm, dry man could. This meant her body produced an excess of blood. Not the kind that clothed your insides. No, bad blood. Leftover blood. Blood that needed to be expelled. Thus, menstruation. Your body, unable to use all that flawed material, had no choice but to dump it once a month. But when you became pregnant, the blood had somewhere to go. It nourished the fetus, fed the womb, and, after birth, it traveled to the breasts, where it transformed into milk. This wasn't just symbolic. This was their scientific explanation. Milk wasn't a separate fluid. It was refined period blood, a warm alchemical conversion from one feminine mystery to another. You might be wondering, what about women who didn't bleed much, or at all? What about those who couldn't lactate? Quiet. That's not part of the theory. The fact that it didn't make sense only made it stronger. Because when something's mysterious, and no one wants to ask too many questions, the myth is harder to kill. This blood-to-milk logic also had a theological appeal. Christian scholars pointed to it as proof of divine design. A woman was made to bleed when not pregnant, and to produce nourishment when she was. It was seen as a built-in system of balance, harmony, divine punishment with a lactating loophole. And yes, this also reinforced the idea that a woman's true purpose was reproductive. Because if your blood could be transformed into life-giving milk, then clearly your body only made sense within the context of motherhood. Which meant, of course, that if you weren't pregnant, you were wasting good blood. A barren woman was seen as unproductive, a social liability, possibly even a medical threat, because without pregnancy, the excess blood had nowhere to go. And according to the logic of the day, it could stagnate, fester, poison the mind, drive you mad. They had a word for this, plethora. Not a nice word. It sounds like a cozy blanket, but it was used to describe a dangerous surplus of feminine fluids. If you didn't bleed enough, hysteria. If you bled too much, hysteria. If you bled on time but still complained, hysteria. Everything returned to that one simple truth. You were broken unless you were breastfeeding. And so the theory of blood into milk became more than biology. It became a narrative, a moral structure, a tidy loop. Bleed, conceive, stop bleeding, produce milk, bleed again, repeat. Any interruption to that loop made society nervous. Now, this idea wasn't entirely without observation. People noticed that bleeding stopped during pregnancy. They noticed that breasts grew, swelled, and produced something useful. And without microscopes or endocrinology, what they came up with was, well, kind of creative and deeply incorrect. Still, you have to admire the confidence. They were writing about bodily functions they had never experienced, never studied up close, and barely understood. And they wrote about them with absolute certainty. It's the historical equivalent of a man interrupting you during your own doctor's appointment to explain how your uterus probably works. And let's not forget, these ideas didn't just live in scrolls. They shaped care, policy, and power. A woman who couldn't produce milk might be seen as spiritually deficient. A woman who bled irregularly might be considered cursed, or worse, untrustworthy. Entire gender norms were reinforced by a misunderstanding of internal plumbing. So what's the legacy of all this? Today, no one believes milk is made of menstrual blood. We hope. But the cultural assumptions it created about fertility, value, and purpose still linger. We still treat women's bodies as machines that must perform in specific ways. We still link worth to biological function. And we still, in many places, ignore the real science in favor of old stories that feel more comfortable than the messy truth. But the truth is, milk is not blood. Your period is not waste. And your body isn't malfunctioning just because it isn't making babies. It's working, it's bleeding, it's healing, and it's not waiting for a scroll to validate it. So raise a glass of whatever you'd prefer to all the women who fed their children with their bodies, and to all the ones who didn't. Because blood doesn't need to turn into milk to matter. Centuries later, another woman, It's that time again. You sigh. And then you do what women have always done. You adapt. There's no bathroom, no plumbing, no branded hygiene aisle with 12 kinds of pads and 40 kinds of scented shame. It's just you, your bleeding body, and the morning's to-do list. First things first, the rag belt. You grab a strip of cloth, something absorbent, something soft, ideally not already full of holes, and you fold it. Once, twice, maybe 3 times if it's going to be a long day. You wrap it carefully, tying it into place with a belt made of string, leather, or scrap fabric. It's not glamorous, but it works, mostly, unless it shifts, which it will, often. Now you understand where the phrase "on the rag" comes from, because that's literally what you are. And yes, you'll be washing it by hand later, in cold water, away from anyone who might see. Because even though this is perfectly normal, no one wants to talk about it, let alone see the proof. To disguise the risk of leaks, you throw on your red petticoat. It's not a fashion statement, it's camouflage, a practical layer of protection in case the cloth doesn't hold. The deep crimson blends with any stains, and if anyone asks, they won't. They already know. In some regions, women sewed extra folds into their skirts, not for flair, but to trap any wayward blood before it reached the outer layers. Strategic tailoring, period edition. If you're lucky, you have access to moss. It grows in the bogs. It's soft, surprisingly absorbent, and if you layer it just right, it holds for a few hours. Not ideal for long walks, but better than bark. Some women line their rags with buffalo hide or soft leaves, depending on the season. Others, the ones near rivers, use linen strips, soaked and sun-dried between cycles. They're scratchy when they're too dry, damp when they're not. There is no winning. And then there's the smell. Yes, you notice it. You all do. So you stuff your pockets with herbs, mint, lavender, sometimes rosemary, and tuck a bundle into your bodice. Not because you're trying to be romantic, because you're trying not to offend anyone when you walk past. You've seen women tuck dried petals into their belts. You've seen them sprinkle crushed leaves along the hem of their skirts. You've even seen someone carry a nosegay, a bundle of flowers pressed to the face like a natural filter. Some days it works. Other days, the wind isn't feeling merciful, and you're reminded, again, that your body doesn't belong to you in silence. It announces itself, without warning, without apology. And everyone else seems to think that's your problem to fix. In crowded markets and communal homes, you become a master of subtlety, shuffling your skirt lower, moving less, standing just so. It's a choreography of concealment, rehearsed without ever being taught, because no one told you what to do. You watched, you copied, you learned. This is the changing routine of early womanhood, a monthly ritual not of rest or reverence, but of logistics, and sometimes humiliation. Because if you bleed through your rag and onto your seat, the evidence is public, the shame is personal, and while no one says anything, the glances are loud, louder than they should be for something so ordinary. The irony, of course, is that everyone knows. Half the women around you are wearing the same cloth belt. They're just better at faking normal. And the other half? Well, they write the rules. They say you can't sit on sacred chairs. They say you can't touch certain tools. They say you can't prepare food or water the plants or even walk barefoot in the wrong direction. Because what if the blood leaks into the soil? What if it makes the crops wilt? What if it offends the spirits? No one ever worries that the mud on a farmer's boot might taint the grain. But your blood, that's different. So you do what women have always done. You manage it, quietly, with grace and a little ingenuity and a lot of moss. You wrap, you tuck, you pretend nothing's happening, even when it's clearly happening. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the petticoat holds, the wind stays still, the cloth stays clean, and you get through another day without becoming that woman, the one who bled visibly, the one who reminded the world that female bodies aren't always polite. But even if the worst happens, the stain, the smell, the whispered commentary, you endure it. Because you know what they don't. You're not weak. You're not dirty. You're just bleeding. In a world that still hasn't figured out how to deal with it. And when you go home, you hang the rag to dry. You light some herbs. You breathe in something that isn't shame. Because tomorrow, you'll do it all again. Bleeding. It's not just uncomfortable. It's unclean. You're not allowed in the temple. You're not allowed to pray or cook or sit in the good chair. You can't touch sacred objects. You can't sleep in your usual bed. You can't be seen, not like this, because religion has spoken, and your uterus is offending God. Let's begin with the Torah, ancient Hebrew law, passed down from prophet to priest to community. According to Leviticus, when a woman menstruates, she is niddah, ritually impure. Anything she touches becomes unclean. Anyone who touches her becomes unclean. She must remain separate for 7 days, plus any additional bleeding. And after that, she must immerse herself in a mikvah, a ritual bath, before resuming normal life. To be clear, this wasn't framed as cruelty. It was seen as law, structure, sacred rhythm. But for you, it means isolation. You eat alone, sleep alone. You avoid eye contact and move through the world like a ghost, waiting for the clock to run out on your body's offense. In Orthodox Judaism, some still practice these rules today. Others, Reform, conservative, secular, interpret them differently, or not at all. But the shadow of unclean lingers. Now hop across the continent to India. Here you're not unclean for a week. You're forbidden. Menstruating women are often banned from entering Hindu temples. You can't pray, cook, or even share a kitchen. In some homes, you're not allowed to sit on the same furniture as others, or sleep in the same room. Some women are sent to separate huts. Others just retreat inward. In certain rural communities, this isn't just custom. It's enforced. You bleed, you vanish. Ironically, the Vedas, some of Hinduism's oldest texts, mention menstruation only briefly, and not as punishment. But over time, layers of cultural interpretation piled on, and by the time it reached your grandmother's village, the meaning had changed. Now your period isn't sacred, it's suspicious. And the only way to prove your worth again? Stop bleeding. In Christianity, it wasn't much better. Early bishops, monks, and church fathers had a particular talent for turning natural processes into moral failings. According to many theologians, menstruation was Eve's curse, the bodily price of original sin. Because she ate the fruit, you now suffer cramps and blood and shame every 28 days. Fair trade, apparently. St. Jerome, a 4th century scholar, warned that menstruating women should not approach the altar. Pope Dionysius of Alexandria claimed that pious women would never dare to receive communion during their period. Not because they were impure in soul, but because their bodies were temporarily offensive. You didn't need to do anything wrong. You just needed to exist. And your punishment? Absence. Of course, rules varied by region. In some early Christian sects, menstruating women were barred from church entirely. In others, they were allowed to attend, quietly, in the back, no touching, no communion. Some theologians argued against the bans, others doubled down. And so the rules didn't just confuse, they isolated. You couldn't serve or worship or sing. You were spiritual collateral damage until your cycle passed. But not every faith played along. Sikhism, for example, rejected the idea of menstrual impurity outright. Guru Nanak, founder of the Sikh religion in the 15th century, taught that the menstrual cycle was divinely ordained, a natural, necessary part of life. He asked a radical question. If menstruation makes a woman impure, then how can any of us exist? Mic drop. In Buddhism, views vary. In some traditions, women choose to refrain from temple activity during menstruation, not because they are impure, but for comfort or focus. In others, there are no rules at all. The Buddha, unlike many of his contemporaries, didn't spend his time writing womb-based restrictions, and it shows. Still, in parts of Japan, Thailand, and Tibet, local customs evolved, and menstruating women were subtly discouraged from participating fully. Not always officially, but enough to notice. So whether you're in a mountain monastery or a corner temple, the message echoes. Your bleeding makes people uncomfortable. And if it makes the gods uncomfortable too, well, that's not up for debate. Even in modern spaces, remnants remain. In some households, girls are told to avoid pickles, sacred books, or prayer rooms during their period. Not out of cruelty, but tradition. In schools, temples, and homes, whispers still follow menstruating bodies. And you, with your heating pad and your herbal tea and your quiet endurance, carry centuries of sacred suspicion on your shoulders. But here's the truth, whispered beneath the weight of doctrine. You are not dirty. You are not unclean. You are not a threat to anyone's salvation. You're just human, bleeding, healing, moving forward. And if the divine has a problem with that, maybe they need a ritual bath. Imagine a world where bleeding every month makes you impure, untouchable, and socially inconvenient. Now imagine that not bleeding makes you suspicious, infertile, or potentially possessed. Welcome to ancient medicine, where every outcome is the wrong one, and the uterus is always to blame. Across early civilizations, a woman's menstrual cycle wasn't just biology. It was evidence. Evidence of youth, of health, of fertility. If you bled regularly, you were working properly. If you didn't, well, someone was going to notice, and not in a good way. A girl who failed to get her first period on schedule might be considered cursed, touched by evil, punished by the gods, or just deeply broken and in need of urgent repair. And that repair was rarely gentle. Midwives, healers, and sometimes priests would attempt to restart a woman's cycle using whatever tools they had. Herbs, hot stones, steam baths, massage, fasting, bleeding, yes, bleeding, to restore the bleeding. They believed that if blood didn't flow out, it would turn inward and poison you, rot your organs, cloud your mind, possibly even give you seizures or violent dreams. The diagnosis? Retained menses. The treatment? Aggressive and extremely vague. One prescription called for the woman to sit over a boiling pot of spiced wine, because, of course, menstruation could be summoned like a reluctant genie. Another involved ingesting wild herbs known to stimulate uterine contractions, many of which were toxic, hallucinogenic, or both. In some cultures, women were encouraged to dance vigorously. In others, they were prayed over for days, sometimes beaten with soft switches to shock the blood back into motion, because nothing restarts a delayed cycle like trauma and dehydration. There were even cases where spiritual possession was suspected. If a woman hadn't bled in several months and displayed symptoms like mood swings, fatigue, or anxiety, she wasn't hormonal. She was haunted. In ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets recorded rituals to banish the demon Lamashtu, believed to cause infertility and menstrual irregularity. Priests would chant over the afflicted woman, offer sacrificial bread to the gods, and anoint her with oils. Then they would wait. If she bled, the demon had been defeated. If she didn't, another round. No pressure. Even in ancient Greece, the famed doctors weren't much help. Hippocrates, yes, him again, believed that when blood didn't flow out as it should, it boiled internally and overflowed into other organs. He recommended physical activity, warm baths, or ideally, pregnancy. Always pregnancy, because when in doubt, put a fetus in it. And Galen? He thought menstrual suppression could cause melancholia, a condition we'd now call depression, because of black bile trapped in the system. His solution? A good purge, maybe some leeches, possibly a nice slap on the back with a dead fish. Okay, not the fish, but would it have been that surprising? In medieval Europe, the logic grew more intense and more moral. If you didn't bleed, maybe God was punishing you, or maybe your womb was discontent, or maybe you were barren, which in some households was cause for annulment, exile, or worse. Women who didn't menstruate could be accused of everything from witchcraft to lying about their gender, because again, the standard for a functioning female body was very simple. Bleed on time, conceive on command, smile politely. Meanwhile, in traditional Chinese medicine, the absence of menstruation, called amenorrhea, was blamed on disharmony between the spleen, the liver, and the kidneys, energy blockages, imbalance in the qi. Treatments ranged from acupuncture to complex herbal concoctions. It wasn't always cruel, but it was deeply ritualized and not always effective. In some African traditions, menstrual absence was interpreted as spiritual imbalance. Healers would use divination to find the cause. Sometimes ancestral displeasure was blamed, and animal sacrifices were made to appease the spirits. If that didn't work, the woman might be isolated, because an unbleeding body made people nervous. You see, in a world without ultrasounds or hormone panels or endocrinology, the body was judged based on what it did visibly. And if your womb went quiet, you were no longer reliable. And while the treatments varied, boiling wine in Greece, isolation huts in Nepal, fertility dances in West Africa, the fear remained constant. Not bleeding was unnatural, unacceptable, and sometimes unforgivable. This fear extended to older women too. Once you reached menopause, people assumed your body had given up. Some cultures saw you as wise, others as a liability. Without periods, your purpose was assumed to be over. And the irony? In many of these societies, menstruation was treated as impure, shameful, or even sinful, until it disappeared. Then it became desirable, necessary, proof that you were still viable. Too much blood, you're cursed. Too little blood, also cursed. Perfectly balanced, as all things never are. So while modern medicine has at least moved past the boiling wine phase, the anxiety remains. To this day, many women suffer from undiagnosed menstrual disorders for years, because even now the body is often expected to behave a certain way. Predictably, quietly, obediently, and when it doesn't, we panic, we diagnose, we try to fix what might not be broken. Simply misunderstood, because the truth is the body changes. Cycles shift, hormones ebb, and sometimes there's nothing wrong with not bleeding. Sometimes It's just your body being its unpredictable, remarkable self. But try telling that to someone with a cauldron and a prayer scroll. You're standing at the edge of something. Not quite a girl anymore, but not quite allowed to say otherwise. You've gotten your first period, and just like that, everything has changed. You're now both more than you were, and somehow less. Because while menstruation confirms that you're growing up, it also triggers a new set of rules. Quiet ones, heavy ones, the kind that get passed down through whispers, not books. Your blood is proof of fertility, but it also makes you dangerous. And now your purity is under surveillance. You are warned, gently, firmly, repeatedly, to be careful. Careful how you sit, how you dress, how you talk to boys, and above all else, how you handle your bleeding. Because while your body may be developing, your virginity is still your most important accessory, and anything that might disturb it must be avoided. Which brings us to menstrual products. In much of the world, especially in the last few hundred years, anything insertable was seen not as practical, but suspect. Tampons? Absolutely not. They might break the hymen, and if the hymen breaks, how will anyone know you're pure? It's an odd thing, isn't it? How much a society can obsess over a membrane it doesn't understand. Newsflash. The hymen isn't a seal. It's not a freshness sticker. It doesn't determine anything about your moral worth. And it certainly doesn't come with a security tag. But in many cultures, the hymen was, and still is, the badge of virginity. Not your behavior, not your choices, not your will. Just a thin piece of tissue that might be gone from riding a horse, or climbing a tree, or simply existing. Still, none of that mattered. Because if there was any chance that a tampon, or a sponge, or a menstrual cup might tamper with your so-called innocence, it was banned. Instead, you were handed pads, rags, cloth belts, large, visible, impractical things that crinkled when you moved and leaked when you sneezed. Comfort wasn't the point. Control was. Even in the early 20th century, tampon advertisements were designed only for married women, because it was assumed that single women, especially young girls, should have no reason to put anything up there. As if managing your own body was some kind of violation. In schools, girls were taught the basics of periods, sort of. You were told how to use a pad, how to change it, how to throw it away discreetly. But you weren't told how to track your cycle. You weren't told what pain was normal, or what symptoms needed attention. And you definitely weren't told that you had options. Why? Because if you learned too much, you might start asking questions. And girls who asked questions were rarely considered pure. The irony, of course, is that your period was proof that you were entering womanhood. And yet, once it arrived, you were expected to pretend it wasn't happening, to keep it secret, keep it silent, keep it clean. You're growing up, but don't grow too much. You're fertile now, but don't act like it. You're allowed to bleed, just don't make anyone think about it. And so you learn the choreography, pad in pocket, bathroom trip announced vaguely, tampon wrappers opened in slow motion so no one hears, apologies mumbled when asking for a pad, eyes darting before passing one discreetly across the desk. Even now, in a world with access to healthcare and education and entire supermarket aisles dedicated to menstruation, the purity myth sticks around. There are countries where girls miss school every month because they don't have access to sanitary products or because they're not allowed to use them. There are places where hymen reconstruction surgery is still performed to prove virginity. There are homes where young girls are still told, "Don't use that. It'll take your virginity." As if virginity is something you can misplace with cotton. The obsession with purity has always been less about bodies and more about control. If your period makes you capable of reproduction, then suddenly everyone else wants a say in how that body is used, hidden, or managed. Menstruation wasn't just a biological milestone. It was a legal, social, spiritual turning point. One you didn't get to control. In some ancient societies, a girl's first period was marked with celebration. In others, with isolation. But in many, it was met with silence. And silence is where shame tends to grow. So here you are, at the edge of adulthood, learning a difficult truth. Your blood will be watched, interpreted, regulated. Not by your body, but by the people around it. And yet, despite the rules, despite the warnings, despite the hymen panic, you'll make choices. Smart ones, informed ones, quiet ones maybe at first, but eventually loud enough to matter. Because being a woman isn't about passing someone else's purity test. It's about living in your body and finally actually owning it. Whether you wear red petticoats or leak onto your sheets. Whether you choose pads or tampons or nothing at all. Whether you bleed on schedule or not at all. You're not defined by how intact you are. You're defined by how well you know yourself. And if that makes someone uncomfortable, well, they can go clutch their pearls. Centuries have passed. Empires have risen and collapsed. We've discovered antibiotics, launched satellites, and built tiny computers we now use to argue online. And yet, if you're menstruating, you're still told, don't cook, don't swim, don't exist so loudly. Because some myths, they really know how to hold on. Let's rewind. In ancient times, menstruation was viewed through a lens of awe, fear, and confusion. Was it divine, dangerous? Both? You might poison crops, sour milk, kill bees, wilt flowers. Your presence could ruin the dinner. Now fast forward to the modern world, where science has explained menstruation down to the molecule. And still, somewhere between the school nurse and the supermarket aisle, the awkwardness lingers. It lingers in whispered warnings like, don't wash your hair on your period, it'll give you cramps. Don't enter the kitchen, it might upset the food. Don't swim, the blood will attract sharks. Yes, actual advice. It lives in the bathroom stalls, where tampons are passed like contraband. In the classroom, where girls are still afraid to raise their hands and ask for help. In the temples, where menstruating women are told to stay away. And in the media, where commercials show women joyfully running through fields, as if they've just bled their way to spiritual enlightenment. And the shame? That's generational. You learn early. Don't mention it. Wrap the pad. Conceal the string. Whisper the request. If you bleed through your clothes, cover it fast, because even in 2025, that stain can still feel like a social death sentence. Why? Because we inherited centuries of superstition and wrapped them in modern packaging. Consider the pink tax. From ancient Egypt's papyrus tampons to today's overpriced pads and menstrual cups, period products have always come with strings attached, literal and financial. In many countries, menstrual hygiene products are still taxed as luxury goods. Luxury, as if bleeding is a choice and wanting to manage it is indulgent. As if anyone has ever moaned in pain on a tile floor and thought, you know what would be fabulous right now? A plush gold tampon. Meanwhile, razors and dandruff shampoo are often tax exempt. Because apparently, shaving your chin is more essential than not bleeding on the furniture. This isn't just policy, it's legacy. The idea that menstruation is something extra, optional, secondary, slightly embarrassing, which brings us to media. For decades, period commercials didn't show blood, they showed blue liquid. Because God forbid we depict reality. Viewers might faint. We were told our periods should smell like lavender. That discreet packaging was key. That the goal was to stay invisible, even while shedding the lining of an organ every single month. And if someone dared to joke about periods in public, cue the scandalized gasps. The myth of silence was always louder than the truth. Now, zoom in on schools, where some teachers still skip over the menstruation chapter, where girls are handed a pamphlet and told, "You'll figure it out," where menstrual leave is still controversial, where boys are never taught enough, and girls are taught just enough to feel nervous. In many parts of the world, girls still miss school during their periods because of shame, lack of access, or both. They fall behind, stay home, drop out, all because we're still scared of blood. And temples? In some places, women are still banned from religious spaces during their period because they're seen as impure, distracting, disruptive. Even though those same women are often the ones cleaning the altar, cooking the meals, and raising the next generation of worshipers. Funny how that works. But perhaps the most enduring myth of all is the idea that menstruation is something to be managed quietly. You can bleed, but don't make it political. Don't make it loud. Don't make anyone else uncomfortable. Because the discomfort of others has always been more urgent than the pain of the person actually bleeding. So where does this leave us? Somewhere between progress and pantomime. Yes, we've come a long way. There are now apps to track your cycle. Menstrual cups are sold in major pharmacies. Celebrities are breaking taboos. Schools are, sometimes, teaching real science. And period poverty is finally being addressed in global policy conversations. But walk into any room, mention, "I'm on my period," and count how many people don't shift awkwardly in their seats. Ancient myths may not be carved into temple walls anymore, but they're etched into habits, customs, advertising copy, and tax codes. They survived. From the papyrus of the pharaohs to the pink packaging on today's shelves. From Babylonian exile huts to modern menstrual leave debates. From burning toad pouches to period pain being dismissed as probably just stress. They made it. And so did you. So next time someone suggests you shouldn't cook during your period, ask them if their soul will curdle or if that's just the milk. When someone flinches at the word tampon, remind them you're not summoning a demon. You're absorbing fluid. And if someone dares to say menstruation is gross, unnatural, or shameful, smile sweetly. Then hand them a history book. You've heard a lot tonight. Gods and taboos, papyrus tampons and wandering wombs, burned toads, boiled wine, red petticoats, taxed pads. But here's the part that no scroll, no tablet, no crumbling parchment will tell you. Most menstruation stories were never written down. Not because they didn't exist, but because the people living them weren't invited to the table. History, for the longest time, was written by scribes, priests, kings, men who were often too busy conquering land to document what was happening in their own households. And when it came to blood, unless it was spilled on a battlefield, it just didn't make the cut. So the experience of menstruation, of living in a body that bleeds, was pushed to the shadows, kept quiet, tucked behind doors, passed down in whispers from sister to sister. mother to daughter, friend to friend in a corner of the courtyard. You won't find it in the grand chronicles of empires. No ancient historian took a break from cataloging wars to note, meanwhile, the women were managing their cramps with damp moss and herbal tea. Because, you see, period pain wasn't epic. It didn't alter the fate of nations. It didn't glorify a hero. It just happened every month to half the population. So obviously irrelevant. But those unwritten stories, they mattered. They mattered because they were survival manuals. You didn't learn how to fold rags from a scroll. You learned by watching your aunt. You didn't know what herbs to drink from a priest. You knew because the village midwife told you, with a wink and a frown. You didn't write essays on the guilt or the shame or the way you curled up and wished the world would leave you alone. You just endured it. And when your daughter asked why it hurt so much, you said, because it does. And that was the archive, the oral record, softly spoken, rarely preserved, which is why, centuries later, historians try to reconstruct menstrual life by scavenging crumbs. A line in a medical text, a mention in a diary, a blood stain in the lining of a burial gown. That's what's left. Even the art of ancient cultures is vague. You'll find sculptures of goddesses with full hips and swollen bellies, but no one painted the moment she bled. No mosaic shows a woman curled over, face flushed, linen stained. Because dignity demanded discretion, and discretion demanded silence. The shame didn't always start with religion or medicine. Sometimes it was just the absence of acknowledgement, as if to say, if no one writes it down, maybe it never happened. But it did. Over and over, month after month, women bled in temples, in fields, in royal palaces, in huts. They bled through wars and droughts, famines and coronations. They bled while giving birth, while praying, while cooking, while standing guard. And yet, the official record stayed dry. What's missing from history isn't just facts. It's perspective. It's the feeling of washing stained cloth in a stream at night. The panic of bleeding early while wearing your only clean skirt. The relief of seeing blood after weeks of wondering if you were pregnant. The exhaustion of knowing no one would ask how you were because the answer would make them uncomfortable. This silence matters because it shaped what we inherited. It's why generations grew up thinking periods were unnatural, shameful, or too embarrassing to discuss. It's why young girls still hesitate to speak up when their cramps are too much to bear. It's why some women still carry toilet paper in their purse just in case, decades into adulthood. Because when the story isn't told, the stigma fills in the blanks. But here's the good news. We are no longer living in silence. Today, we're writing it down, talking about it, teaching it, telling jokes about it, making art about it, making 3-hour sleep history videos about it. Yes, like this one. And by doing so, we're filling in the gaps, not with blue liquid and soft piano music, but with truth, humor, anger, relief. Because the story of menstruation isn't just about ancient rituals and ridiculous theories. It's about resilience, the quiet, monthly, underreported kind. So if you've ever felt alone in your pain, if you've ever wondered why no one warned you it could be this awful, if you've ever bled in silence and resented it, know this. You are part of a lineage older than written language, and your story, even if no one wrote it down before, is valid. It's real. It's messy. It's complicated. And it deserves to be told. You made it. You've bled through 3,000 years of superstition, scorched remedies, and dusty old men in robes declaring what your uterus should and shouldn't be doing. You've endured Pliny the Elder's unhinged list of period curses. You've steamed over boiling wine. You've been exiled, silenced, doubted, and taxed just for the privilege of bleeding. And yet, here you are, still bleeding, still brilliant. Now, the worst is behind you. There are no temples to avoid, no red petticoats to wring out by candlelight, no herbal compresses made from goat bile and burnt herbs, just you and the quiet, and maybe a metaphorical heating pad, one that wraps around your story and says, you were never unclean, just misunderstood. Tonight, you've wandered through moonlit myths, wandering wombs, and the ridiculous fear that a tampon might ruin your soul. You've heard the silence in the archives, the stories that were never written, but always lived, and you've stitched them together with warmth, with truth, with gentle defiance. Because knowing this history isn't just about the past. It's about reclaiming what was buried under shame and superstition. You don't have to carry that anymore. So breathe easy. No one's checking your hymen. No one's banning you from the kitchen. No one's blaming the weather on your uterus. You're allowed to exist exactly as you are. Whether you're bleeding, cramping, bloated, or gloriously free of it all, history did its worst, and you outlasted it. Now rest. You've earned it. Let the cramps fade. Let the myths go. Let the old voices hush themselves back into dusty scrolls and closed doors. You are not cursed. You are not impure. You are not alone. You're part of a lineage that survived in silence and is now finally being heard. Sleep well. No shame. No temples to avoid. No Pliny. Just soft blankets, slow breaths, and a quieter kind of power. The kind that bleeds and endures. Good night, listener. Sweet dreams from the grumpy historian.